And I'm Lisa Mazzie from Marquette University with Louise Trubek, who is a professor emerita at University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School. And we have lots of questions to ask, lots of things to find out about. So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born? Where was your family living?
Okay, I was born in New York City, and I was raised in Brooklyn, New York.
Okay, and did you have a big family or?
No, I had one sister.
Older or younger?
Younger.
Younger, okay. And what did your parents do when you were born?
Yes, well, my father was a letter carrier, and my mother stayed home until I went away to college, and then she worked in the Medicaid office.
Okay, and when you were growing up, and you went to school in Brooklyn then, I imagine?
Yes.
Can you tell me about your early education?
Yes, well, I went to public schools, and the New York City public schools are, they're variable, but they were quite good, and I was a good student, and I went through, this is relevant, I went through middle school, what they call middle school now, in 2 years. So when I went to high school, I was a year younger, and that relates to my college. But I should say about my early life that my family had what I used to call, some people amused by, the working poor. And this is relevant, of course, to my later career.
Right, okay. So when did you and your sister, were you close as children?
We were very close, very close.
Okay.
And I went to college when I was 16. I left at the end of my junior year in high school in a special program. And Wisconsin was one of the schools that had signed up for this program where you could go to college at the end of, as long as you were 16, at the end of your sophomore or junior year.
And so you went at the end of your junior year?
Yes.
And that's a little ways from home, though. How did that feel?
Yes. I was anxious to get away. I didn't like high school. I loved middle school. I didn't like high school. And I was happy to go away, and I had a wonderful time. And in fact, I am here this weekend with a reunion of those students who came in that program in that period, which was the early 1950s.
Okay, so then you were in Wisconsin in the early 1950s, and so you had mentioned earlier you were asked to do some sort of interview about what it was like to be here as a student in the 50s.
Yes.
So what was it like to be here?
Well, Wisconsin in the 1950s, we always say, only half jokingly, that Wisconsin in the 1950s invented the national 1960s.
Okay.
Berkeley claims that, but it's actually Wisconsin.
Okay.
It was very political at that time in Wisconsin. We had a lot of socialist and communist organizations and a lot of political activity among a small group. Obviously, it wasn't all of Wisconsin, but it was notable because in that period of the McCarthy period, the prevalence of these organizations was very notable, and it became somewhat political, and I was involved in some of the politics around that. I was also active in programs on anti-discrimination, and I served on the Student Senate. But of course, because I came in this special program, of which there were only very few women, most of them were men, it was very co-ed, the university, but I also had a lot of contacts with various kinds of people. So it was very exciting for me, very social, but also quite political. And I was a very good student, and I majored in history.
So you said your father was a letter carrier and your mother was at home when you were growing up. So how did college come into your mind then, or what made you want to go to college at all?
Well, I was part of the immigrant population. I was the daughter of immigrants who came, I was the granddaughter of immigrants who came over in the early 20th century, late 19th century from Europe and from Russia, Poland, that area, and we were Jewish. And those people, that generation, valued education above all. So I was that kind of poor person who understood that education was the way out, and there was tremendous interest in being educated.
And even for young women at that time.
Yes, and of course there were 2 girls.
Right, right.
So I think that was somewhat significant.
Okay, so when you went to high school, you knew that you wanted to go to college.
Oh, I never thought about not going to college.
Okay.
My father was a big union person, so I was very interested in labor relations. And if I had not gone to Wisconsin, I probably would have gone to Cornell and gone to their labor relations school.
Okay. So when you went to college, what did you think, how did you see your future then? What did you think you might do?
Well, fairly early on, funny, I took those days they had these aptitude tests, career aptitude tests, I guess, and I went and took one of them. And at the end of it, the guy said to me, well, you can either be a social worker or a lawyer. Those are the 2 things that are, and of course I ended up in a sort of that combination. So it was interesting. So I guess I indicated, he saw that. And of course I was involved in student government and in political activity. Now, what the person interviewed me particularly was about Wisconsin in the 50s was the political aspects of that, and the relationship with the left constituency that was here active as students. And so that I was very familiar with progressive politics, or politics in the sense of within the university.
Right. So what sparked your interest in politics?
Well, I was interested in social change, improving, the lot of people and so forth, and that is, of course, eventually why I went to law school. So I thought early on, in fact, I applied to Columbia Law School at the end of my junior year in Wisconsin, because in that period, Columbia took students, you didn't have to complete college in order to go to law school in that period. And but then I would have really been young.
Right, right.
So I decided to not do that, and I stayed for my senior year.
Okay, and what did you major in then?
History.
History?
History was Wisconsin, of course, has a famous history department. It had a famous history now, and it had a famous history department then. And so I majored in, took mostly American history.
Okay. And then you were involved in a lot of, like you said, a lot of political committees or activities on campus.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned, you met your husband in college?
I met my husband, yes. And we met doing politics. We were both on the Student Senate. We were not elected. At those days, the Student Senate was some people were elected, and some people, because they served on certain committees, were because of that committee where they were on the Senate. So he was in charge of, head of the Publications Committee, and I was head of the Housing Committee. And housing was important because we pushed to have an anti-discrimination clause where the fraternities and sororities had to no longer have any kind of discriminatory provisions by 1960. This was, now, I was in college 53 to 57. So that was a big activity. And of course, it did succeed, and they were eliminated, I think, by 1960.
Excellent. Okay. So then this aptitude test, was that in high school or
No, that was in college.
That was in college. So then did that put the idea of being a lawyer in your mind?
Well, maybe. I certainly didn't know any lawyers. In fact, when I applied to law school, you had to have they asked for a letter in those days from a lawyer, and we had only my family had only one friend who was a lawyer, who had a small practice of some type. So, but I guess it put it in my mind. I took a course in legal process, which my husband took also, which is a kind of famous course, which was an undergraduate course taught by very well-known political scientists and lawyers.
Okay, so then I think the both of you applied to law school then, and he was a lawyer?
No, I applied. I went immediately. I applied when I was a senior in college, but my husband was going into ROTC, so I had to go into the Army for 6 months. And so I applied first. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do when he was a senior, and I applied to Yale, Harvard, and Columbia, got into everything, and decided to go to Yale, which turned out to be fairly significant. And I went to Yale because it had a reputation of being progressive, and doing a lot of social science kind of law. That's what I was interested. So I knew early on what I was interested in, and that is why I went to Yale.
Okay. And when you arrived, let's see, was that in 58, 57 when you went to
57.
57. And were there many women there?
There's 6 of us in the class.
And how big was the class?
160.
Okay, so 6 out of 160. Did you become friends with all 6 of them?
Yes, it was very shocking to me. I had no idea when I applied to law school and went to law school that how few women there were. Wisconsin was very co-ed, and the head of the Student Senate was a very remarkable woman, and my classes had plenty of women in it. I was just totally shocked to walk in the door and see all these men, and many of the men in those days had gone through single-sex schools their entire life.
Mm-hmm.
They had gone to prep schools, they had gone to Yale or Harvard, which were then all singles, all men, and they were just totally shocked to have women in the classroom. And I was shocked to be one of the few women. But the women, it was interesting. In those days, there was only one women's bathroom, and it had a lounge. And somebody was saying, in fact, when I first came to Wisconsin in 1973, to the law school, not when I was an undergraduate, the women had a lounge area with couches, because the idea is that women needed to rest.
You need to rest, right.
Exactly.
Right.
They might have their, periods or whatever.
Right.
So there were more facilities for women. So they had lockers, and then they had this kind of chairs, and then the bathroom. And the women were down there all the time because it was the only escape, from this very male world we were in. And so we all kind of knew each other. We didn't all live together because the women couldn't live at Yale. There were dorms, and I mean not the dorms right on where the law school is. They had dorms, and it's funny because they're redoing the campus and they're putting the dorms back in again. They got rid of them, and they used them for different things, and now they're building them back up so that we were real outsiders, that we were not allowed to be there. And of course Yale was all male. The undergraduate. The law school had been co-ed for a long time, since the 19th century, but and there were graduate schools were co-ed.
Right.
So yes, we all knew each other and we all hung around. And in fact, my husband went to Yale the next year. He came, and he went because I was there. Okay. I'm not sure he would have gone to law school otherwise, and he certainly went to Yale because I was there. And in his class there were more women. I think there were 12 women. And in the fall of the year they came in, I invited them all over with the women in my class. And several of them mentioned to me after that was really their first feminist type experience, because they were a little shocked. Why were we just the women invited?
Right.
They didn't identify with that as being significant, because this was pre Betty Friedan, pre first wave or second wave, whatever you ever call that, feminism.
Right.
And so several of them had mentioned to me later about the significance of that. So definitely we knew who each other were. Now, the first year I lived in the women's dorm because I was not married. I didn't get married till the end of my first year in law school when my husband came to law school. Then we got married that summer.
Okay.
And then he went to law school and we had an apartment. We lived together. But the first year I was in the dorm, and that was all the women, or many of the women in the graduate school. So included philosophy majors, science majors, etc. were there in addition to the law.
Okay.
Some of the women in law school.
So did you, how was that being among how did the other male students treat the women students in your class at law school?
Well, a lot of them some of them were interested just as for dating purposes, because it was hard to find, other women. And of course I was engaged, so it sort of took me out of the pool. Some of them I was very friendly with, some of them, and in fact we're having my 55th reunion is 2 weeks from now. This is quite the month of talking about my past and living my past. So we're all going to see each other then, and because we all knew each other. A small class at Yale, 160 people, so you really got to know everybody.
Right.
And I will say this, I was very active in college. I was very talkative, always was talkative. I did not say one word in class the 3 years I was in law school unless I was called on. Not one word.
Because?
Well, that's the question. You know, many, many studies have been done. I didn't realize it. You know, it's only in, I mean, when it was going on, I knew I wasn't talking, but I never thought about it. I didn't realize that it was a negative, which of course it was. But there it is. Obviously, that was the intimidation or whatever it is I felt uncomfortable.
Right.
And so that is, you know, that clearly was due to my being a woman. Also, though, I want to make this point. At Yale Law School, there were very few people of working class backgrounds. So there was a class element in it as well.
Right.
Most of, I wouldn't say most, that's not fair, but a large percentage had gone to elite schools, male, you know, elite Ivy League schools. And many of them were very cultured. Now, it's not completely true. And in my husband's class, no, in my class, but also in my husband's class, they began to bring in, a lot of people came who were educated in yeshivas and came from devout Jewish backgrounds like Alan Dershowitz. So there were pockets. It wasn't uniform at all. And of course, we did not identify by class at all.
Right.
So, but that I think is a factor as well. I mean, I think it was a combination.
Right, right.
And I went to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of other people who had not gone to elite schools, but there were 20, 30 people from Yale, 20, 30 people from Harvard. In other words, there was this sense of you being somehow from, and also from the Midwest schools.
Right, right.
So I think it was a combination of all of that.
Right. And did you notice whether the other women in your class spoke in class or?
Well, it's interesting. It's hard to say there were so few of us, but in retrospect, I became very friendly in recent years with two of the people who were there at that time. One of them was in my class, and the other was a class ahead. And my friend in my class thinks that the woman in the class ahead was very ambitious and very outspoken, and was noticeable for that.
Right.
And there were other women who were very generally successful. That is, they did very well in class and very well in their grades and so forth. Now, the other thing is that in law school, the status of your grades become more and more important, and so, you know, there's a kind of sorting out.
Right.
But I did very well in my outstanding participation was in moot court, which I did very well in moot court, and I did legal aid, and that turned out to be very significant. There were, of course, no clinical programs at all. It was a volunteer, what we would call pro bono now.
Right.
But it wasn't. It was just one of those things. But a lot of people did it, and I did it, and I got an award for my work, which I was totally surprised at. In other words, I had no concept that what I was doing was outstanding in any way. And so that was very significant to me.
Right. Did you how was the professors with the women students, with you and with the other women students while in law school? Did you?
Well,
go ahead.
There was only one woman professor, Ellen Ash Peters, who I believe is still alive today, and they just did something to honor her and so forth. And she then went on the Connecticut Supreme Court, and is very well remembered. And as I say, I believe she's still alive, and I believe there's all kinds of pictures of her and all that. But she was young when I was a student, and she was very. I remember she wore these big suits, you know, so she was all covered up. She was a small, slight woman. Yes. Because she was self-conscious of those days about being a woman. One of the big issues for me, and it's funny talking about Karen Klaus, because I was interested in labor law when I went to law school, and Yale Law School had a program of specialization, which is really unheard of then and has been unheard of since then. And in that period in the 50s, they put in this program where they had like 8 or 10 topics in which you would take 4 or 5 integrated courses, and you would write a paper.
Oh, okay.
And one of them was, there was nothing that was poverty or welfare or anything like that. The only closest was labor law, and I did labor law. But it turned out that I saw labor law as a social movement or as a political kind of thing. They saw it as the NLRB.
Okay.
And it was the most boring, technical, parsing the Supreme Court cases and the NLRB rules. It was awful.
Oh, no.
So, of course, that contributed to my not talking.
Right.
Because that was small. There were maybe 12 of us, and I took maybe 4 or 5 courses together.
Right.
And I didn't do very well, and there was a lot of tension in the class because one of the professors, Harry Wellington, a very famous professor, it turned out, he was young then, and Clyde Summers, who came out of the really labor union kind of thing, and there was a lot of tension between them in the class. And of course, Harry Wellington was the much better known one and the one more highly regarded. So that contributed to this kind of thing. And I realized that that was not going to be for me, because the way and the people there, most of the people in the class, went on to be labor lawyers representing companies.
Oh, okay.
Well, I was interested in labor lawyer representing the workers.
Right. The other side. So, did you have a sense of what you wanted to do when you were done with law school?
Yes, I had a sense of why I wanted to do with law school. When I went to law school, I always say I thought I wanted to be an ACLU lawyer.
Okay.
I guess I thought I wanted to be a labor lawyer, but certainly not after that first class. So I had that vague idea, but I had no idea how I would get to be that. An ACL lawyer in those days, there were maybe 6 in the entire country.
Right.
And there was no career as a public interest lawyer. That was invented in the mid-'60s. So I was pre that. I was pre-legal services. There were legal aid, and when I worked at legal aid, there was a lawyer who worked at legal aid, but most of the people, and there were a few people in legal aid, a lot of them were, volunteer lawyers, and they had the students like us. So there was really no obvious career track. And I didn't really apply for any jobs in big law firms. The first year, people didn't hire first-year students to work in law firms then. I worked as a counselor. The second year, we went on a honeymoon, and so I didn't. So then when I graduated, I became pregnant, and then the year I was pregnant, I was hired as a research assistant to one of the professors. So I really had very little contact with the actual practice.
So the pregnancy thing, let's talk about that. I learned something very interesting that I hadn't known before when I was researching you for this interview, and that you were one of the pre-Griswold plaintiffs.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
Yes. Well, of course, that is one of those funny things in life, that that experience of being the plaintiff in what is called Trubek v. Ullman, which became, as I said in one of the interviews, a footnote to history, has turned out now being this very moment to be very significant, and now I'm famous. So it's a kind of interesting story, but it does tie in. And so when we were, I guess I was my second year, and my husband was the first year. I'm not sure, but I think that's right. We were asked by Fowler Harper and Lou Pollack, who were professors at the law school, if we would be plaintiffs in a lawsuit challenging the Connecticut criminalization of the use and prescription of birth control devices. The case had already started with, not the Supreme Court case, but an earlier version with a previous law school couple. They decided on law school couple because they wanted to have one set of plaintiffs who were interested in birth control for the career of the woman.
Okay.
The other plaintiffs had life or health. Their lives would be lost, or they would have health issues.
Right.
We represented ones who wanted to do it for, I don't want to sneeringly call it lifestyle, because that's the sneering way of putting it, but I wanted to have a career and control my own reproduction.
Right.
And so and I guess it was easy because they were lawyers to find them in the law school. They could have found other couples.
Right.
But so that's what they asked us if we would do it. And Dave and I had come to the Yale Law School from activism as students at Wisconsin. It never occurred to us to say no. We were naive. We were not people who were well versed in the world of big law. Right. We had no idea that it might be considered a stigma. Or might be considered inappropriate,
right?
Any of those things. So we said yes, and then we said, of course, we would use our name. The others were Roe and Doe.
Right, and that's what I was going to ask you. So you were the only couple of the three to not be anonymous.
Yes.
And did they not present anonymity as an option, or you just didn't see the reason?
No, they presented anonymity of an option.
But you just didn't see the reason?
We didn't see the reason for it.
And was it stigmatizing then?
Well, I didn't get admitted to the New York bar.
Really?
Yes, and that the reason they gave for it was because I had to reveal if I had ever been a plaintiff in a litigation, and so I revealed it, and then they became very interested, and they told me the reason. The moral committee, you know, the one that looks at your morality and your character, they said that that ordinarily law students can maintain the residency, the citizenship, if you want to call it, of the parents because they're temporarily students.
Right.
They took the position that because I was married, I took the residency of my husband.
Which was?
New Jersey.
I see.
So that's the reason they gave for denying my admission. I could have, if I moved to New York, I could have.
Really?
So, because the other thing I had done in the filings, they had written that I was a resident of Connecticut. We were residents of Connecticut, and we said no. Citizens of Connecticut. We said no. In the filings of the Trubek v. Ullman, and I wanted them to change it, and they did change it finally. But what I sent to the bar was a draft. It turned out to be, and so in there, so that's what they claimed, that I had taken I had also put that I was a resident of Connecticut. Even if that wasn't true, I took my husband's residency, and they were mostly, you know, the New York, the Brooklyn, it was the Kings County, and that group of people was not sympathetic to the lawsuit.
And if you had not been a woman, if you had been your husband applying for the New York bar, that would probably, you assume that would not be a problem.
I would assume. But of course I don't know because he never did take the New York bar.
Interesting, interesting. So tell me about that case. So you were on as plaintiffs, and then what happened with the case?
Well, then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we went and listened to the argument, and I was pregnant at that time. And Jill Lepore, in her, did you read her piece in the New Yorker? Mm-hmm. Yeah, she talks about that. It's interesting what she chose to take from the interview she did with me. Yes, and so we went down. It was very exciting. But then the Supreme Court denied saying that it was not a true case in controversy, that we didn't have standing.
Because you were pregnant by that time?
No, because they didn't accept the fact that we could not get access to birth control.
Ah.
You could argue the fact that I was pregnant was evidence that we did not. But no, that none of the plaintiffs, they did not prove that sufficiently.
Ah, okay.
So then Planned Parenthood, we did it on behalf of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood wanted to open a clinic. That's why they were challenging, because they were afraid if they opened the clinic that they would be closed down under the statute, and in fact that's what happened. They then opened the clinic, and then they were closed down, and then you got Griswold.
Yes. And I was reading in that piece, in that New Yorker piece, that you weren't a fan of the privacy argument.
No, because that was not the basis for. I wanted the equality argument. I was not to do with my privacy. It had to do with my view that I should, and others like me should be able to control our reproduction. Right. And that's why there's interest in the case now, because there's a group of people who want to rethink the privacy argument because they think it has worked against the interests of women.
Right. And you would agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. Okay. And I wrote an op-ed piece, I don't know if you read that, in 2012, and where I said that I was involved in that lawsuit because I wanted that. And here, what's happened 50 years later is that it's resulted in same-sex marriage. But same-sex marriage was not what I was involved in. I wanted to have women have more choice and have more control of their own reproduction.
Right.
And that hasn't advanced. It's advanced, but not as far. And certainly the idea that lawsuit would end up as the basis for allowing decriminalizing abortion was absolutely as far from my mind as you can imagine.
Right, right, right.
So all in all, it's an amazing, interesting story. Some people have mentioned to me that today would be considered inappropriate for a law professor to ask a law student to be a plaintiff.
Right, right.
In a lawsuit that they were basically putting together.
Right, right.
Because it would be hard to say no. My husband told me that he felt that way. He felt a little
like you had to?
Yes.
Like you had to?
Well, his professors,
Yeah.
I didn't feel that way.
Oh, okay, okay. So, so your daughter was she born when you were in law school or just after?
No, she was born after, a year after.
Okay.
I was pregnant the year I was working. I was already out of law school. And she is actually the one that had the same-sex marriage that Jill Laporte talks about.
Right, and we'll get to, we'll jump ahead later. But so after you graduated then, and you said you wanted to be an ACLU lawyer but weren't sure how, what did you do then after you graduated?
Well, after I graduated, I actually volunteered at the ACLU. After I graduated, we moved to, I had a baby, and then we moved to Washington. My husband worked for the Foreign Aid Program. And then I had another baby. And then when I had the second baby, just before, I guess, when I was pregnant, I began to work part-time at the Supreme Court in the administrative position. And then we went overseas. We went to Brazil. My husband went in the Foreign Aid Program overseas. I was not happy about it, but I went. And then I had a third child while we were in Brazil. And then when we came back, my husband became a teacher at the Yale Law School. So we moved back to New Haven.
Oh, okay. So sort of came full circle. So so back in New Haven and with 3 kids, and then were you at home then or still working part-time?
I was at home. And then, no, I was at home, and then so we moved back 66, so I was at home maybe for 3 years. That's when I became back in the ACLU, volunteer. And then in 66, or 65, 66 was the initiation, really, of the rise of public interest law, and really in 2 formats. There was the creation of the nonprofit public interest law firms funded by the Ford Foundation, and the coining of the word public interest law firm. And at the same time, there began to be a rise of what became called private public interest law firms, where there would be law firms that would take fee-paying cases. They weren't nonprofits, but they would also take what you would call pro bono cases of general interest. And one of those firms was set up in New Haven. And many of the people involved in the nonprofits and this firm were all graduates of the Yale Law School. And I was very familiar with them because my husband was teaching at the Yale Law School, and some of them were, none of them were in, well, some of them were in my class, but mostly they're slightly younger. So I went to this new public interest law firm and said, I want to work with you. And they said, sure, whatever money you bring in, you can have a percentage of it. And that's what I did, and I worked there for 3 years, till 1973. And in that time, I also became involved with the Connecticut section on women, and we were very active in equalizing credit for women in the Connecticut legislature, and we got legislation passed. And in the course of working with that group, we decided to set up a public interest law firm for women in Connecticut called the Connecticut Women's Equal Education and Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund.
Okay.
And that was actually modeled on a law firm that my classmate, Jane Picker, had just set up in Ohio.
Oh, okay. Okay, so in this time that you were working, well, let's go back to the ACLU volunteering. What was your favorite thing that you did there? Was there any particular case you worked on? Or
no, it was much more discussing the cases that who would bring what and bringing the pro bono. I didn't actually do any myself.
Okay.
But the actual work I did was with the group on credit, where we went to the legislature and did lobbying, basically, for credit. And then I did work in the private public interest law firm. I did, personal injury, and we did environmental work and so forth.
Okay. Did you find any challenges there with having the 3 small children and trying to keep your hand in working on legal issues as well, with a husband who's a professor at Yale, and how did all that balance out?
Well, my children all say, I have to stress this in any of these interviews. When we went to Brazil, I had a maid, and I brought back a household worker with me. In those days, it was easy to get visas. Well, people do it all the time. They call it au pairs. Now, of course, they're only nannies. But those days, they did everything. And it was perfectly, you could get those visas, and then she became a citizen, and so ever since, from the day I arrived in Brazil, I had help, and I brought somebody back with me. So I always had full-time live-in household help. And we had sufficient funding, sufficient money. So that was very important. The question of the interaction with my husband is much more difficult and complicated. I see you have some questions on that. That was a much harder and more difficult thing, certainly in retrospect, and of course very much influenced my career here at Wisconsin. But even from what was very interesting is I think the importance of a combination of things in law school, which I think set the tone. Even though I was the one that wanted to go to law school, and my husband was the one that came on. He was a more successful law student than I was. He did better. I was a middle of the class law student. Well, maybe, in fairness, bottom of the top third. But he was a very good law student. He was on the Yale Law Journal, and he clerked in the Second Circuit, and he was a very successful law student. And so that affected to some extent, because you had the status problem, plus you had the woman problem. I did all the cooking, I did all the cleaning. They offered to me to help one of the people running moot court, which is one of the things I told you I was successful in, and I turned it down. I said it was too much for me, keeping up the house and all that. In retrospect, what a terrible decision that was. But that was kind of the sort of way in which it was managed. And I think if I had been a better a more successful law student, he had been a less successful law student, there might have been a different dynamic. So that dynamic started at that point. But I worked really hard to continue my career. I never thought about not going back to work. Those 8 years I was at home, I was thinking all the time, and I was happy when I was home, as opposed to many of my cohort in that period. In the 60s, they were all went and married, and that's what you did, and they went to 7 sister schools and all that. They were unhappy, and many of them got divorced or then went back to school and did things. I had already gotten my profession, and I knew what I wanted to do, and that made me very pleased in the years that I stayed at home. And I also realized that if I was to go back in, I couldn't go back in lockstep, because in those days, until only the last 5 years, right, in law, it was lockstep. Particularly in the firms, you went in there and you were in that class and you moved up, and there was very few people really started their own firms. I mean, certainly women and so forth and so on. And people stayed there their whole life. So for me to enter, where was I going to enter? And so that's why I went to the law firm and volunteered, and that's why I started my own firms, because I felt that I wasn't going to be successed just trying to enter at some level. Right,
to lateral yourself in there.
Exactly.
Yeah. So did your husband play a role in you thinking that you might want to teach someday, or how did it come about that you went from the law firm into academia?
Well, that's completely due to the fact that when we arrived in Madison in 1973. And we arrived in Madison because my husband did not get tenure at Yale, and our life is very circular. The place that he got the offer was Wisconsin, and we went back to where we had come from. I mean, as undergraduates, we had met, and it was not happy in the sense that some people have said to me that one reason that we did that, because there were other options, he could have become a sociologist, he could have gone to practice, that one of the reasons he went to Wisconsin is we knew that we could live in Wisconsin. We knew Wisconsin. We didn't know a soul. Well, he had a couple of people, colleagues, but we didn't know anybody in teaching in the law school. It was a totally different world than an undergraduate.
Right, right. But you knew the community.
We knew the community, and but when I came back, I thought I would. The law school tried to help me, and at that time, you know, it was a very socially progressive time, a lot going on. I got an offer from the Department of Revenue that wanted somebody to look at discrimination in nonprofits and look at who was getting nonprofit status, and I was offered a job at the Department of Revenue to do that. And so I could have done that. I could have gone into that kind of practice. And but then the dean of the law school asked me if I would set up a public interest clinic. And I said, I'll only set up a public interest law firm with a clinic attached. I wanted to keep that public interest law firm independence. I didn't want to just be a clinician. And there wasn't such a thing as being a clinician. I just didn't want to supervise students. At that point, there was a clinic. The Remington Center had started a couple of years before. But those people were lawyers, and the Frank Remington was the professor, and everybody else just worked as lawyers for him. So I wanted to have my own independent firm. So he said, fine, and you set it up. He gave me $10,000, and that was it.
Okay, so 1973, you're back here, and so tell me about the early days. What was it? Did it feel the same? You said it was a different environment here than it was in undergrad, when you were here for undergrad. So what felt different about it? Just because it was the law school? Because
Oh, it's an interesting question. That's funny. I just had a conversation about this at lunch. Well, it was very different. I loved being a student. The atmosphere at Yale was so much, it's ironic because, of course, there's been so much bitterness attached to that period at Yale in terms of what happened to my husband. Before that, it was just like Eden. It was Yale was wonderful. There were all kinds of interesting people. I made wonderful friends. It was just marvelous for everybody. And Madison was a much better place to be a student than to be a faculty. It was a small town. The law school people were not social or friendly. And to this day, people are proud of that. I mean, there were people came up to me and said, well, we don't see each other, but that's the way we like it. And it was very shocking because we had this very rich social and professional life. And I had known a lot of people and who were doing interesting things. And it's funny because I had lunch today with a colleague, and we were talking about, I won't go into any detail because it's law school related, but she was saying to me, well, Louise, you fought hard for the whole period you were here against a lot of difficulties. And I didn't really think of it that, because there were a lot of years when everything, I set up a public interest law very successful for 30 years. But it's true that it was always a little bit of a struggle. And of course, now Wisconsin is certainly not what it was then. So it's in terms of the political atmosphere, let's put it that way. So I don't know really what to say about that. It was hard work, and it was hard for the family. It was a big move for us, a very difficult move, and we did not, the move was hard on everybody.
So and how old were the girls by then?
12, 10, and 7.
Yeah, that's a hard time
Yeah.
to adjust. And
Yeah.
so your husband was on the faculty here, and then you were at the clinic, but you were not, as I think we've talked about, you were not tenure track.
Oh, not tenure track. I wasn't anything.
And they weren't even a clinician.
I wasn't even a clinician. I was nothing, really. I mean, they gave me the title of lecturer, I think, and I got that fairly soon. I stayed that word for 10, and they paid a very minimal amount of money. And I raised all the other money through the public interest law firm. So I funded the public interest law firm, and in the 1981-82, we had a $1 million budget. We had 6 or 8 lawyers working there, and then none of them had any, except for me, I think none of them had any affiliation with the law school. But we always had law students. Some supervised more students than others.
Okay, and did you notice with the students? Did you notice a change over time in interest level with the students, or?
Well, I have never noticed that much. It seems to me it's been more or less constant. But one of the things I did notice is that I came into public interest law out of what you might call political. That is, I was interested in making the world better, making it more equal. A lot of students came in because they wanted to help individuals.
Okay.
And I was shocked by that. And the center was set up originally in the first 2 or 3 years to do systemic reform, is what you would call.
Right.
And the students said, no, 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 we want to help people. And so we started doing individual representation. So that was the big distinction I saw. And in later years, most of the students who came in were interested more in the helping than political. But that varied. In the late 70s, early 80s, you had more students that were interested again in political, in what you might call systemic change.
Right.
So so we always had we were always a very popular program, and I always also taught a seminar within we got, I think, 5 credits. The students who were there. It varied 3 to 5 credits, and included a seminar that I taught within the clinic.
So how did you feel? You said the faculty did not seem very friendly here. Did you feel that it was a gender-based thing, or just a culture of separateness? Or?
It was a culture of separateness.
Okay.
Then there were relatively few women. I didn't notice that after all, because I was kind of used to that. Then the number of women, and I came in '73, was already beginning to get increased slowly up. It was more. Then there were tensions in the faculty, which were not about me, but of course I knew from my husband. Tension among the locally based versus the nationally based, between the more traditional doctrinal and the social science oriented. Those tensions have been at Wisconsin for many, many years, and now it's a different set of tensions. But also there was the national versus international. My husband was international. That was a relatively rare thing. And there was a big separation between the center and the Remington Center. That was a big source of tension from the very beginning.
How so?
Well, hard to understand, but persisted to this day. For 50 years, it never changed.
So the Remington Center, for people who aren't familiar, can you explain?
The Remington Center was set up in 1970. It was only 4 years before, by Frank Remington, who was a very outstanding criminal law professor and scholar and activist, a very impressive person. And he set up a very early clinic to bring legal representation to people in jail. It was not criminal. It was about issues for people while in prison.
Okay. So maybe doing a will for them, or? Yes,
is the way it evolved. I don't want to speak too closely about the early days.
Okay.
But I came in through the dean, Bunn, who was brought in, somewhat a controversial person. He came in, he was a Wisconsin person, but he'd been in Washington for many years. I think he'd been there a couple of years, and he became dean. He didn't last more than 3 years, I think. He set up, he was a wonderful person. He kept on working with me, but he was no longer dean. And the people who were involved in the Remington Center were very attached to that model and to Professor Remington. They were his proteges. And we were never able to develop a clinic-wide identification. It was separate, and from the day one. And I sometimes think about, we talk about path dependencies, and it was just, and I asked many people over the years, because it turned out to be very detrimental for me and my, because I raised the money while they got their money from the state. Because Frank was so well connected, he got a big grant from the state from corrections, and he had that throughout the whole period. Well, I was working to raise the money. And there was just two completely different models. And we never developed, in my day, and it's much better now, I think, but certainly in the period, which was through 2002, 1974 to 2002, we were never able to overcome that.
Okay. What else, is there anything else about the clinic, about your clinic that you want to talk about that I haven't asked?
Well, the question of status of the clinicians, of course, proved very important because that's very important, the story of me and legal education. One thing about the Remington Center is the people running the Remington Center did not want academic status for the lawyers. They thought it was a very positive thing to have the lawyers just work in the clinic, but as lawyers. And of course, they were funded, so they did, but they didn't want academic status. There was a little bit of anti-intellectualism in that.
Right.
And of course, clinicians did not do writing until nationally, till well into the 80s.
Right.
It was considered that we were to bring the real practice as distinction from the people who stood up there and said the impractical thing. We were the people with the field knowledge,
right,
or whatever.
Right. The skills people versus
yes. And we were also the social justice people, but so that was a big issue. So the where we'll be going on this. So the clinic, the development of clinicians within the academic, within Wisconsin, was very, very slow compared to other law schools because of the resistance of the people in the Remington Center. And to some extent myself, because I was raising the money and but then I just could not keep on raising that much money.
Right, right. Were the people in the Remington Center, the people who worked there, were they largely male? All male?
They were largely male. But then they had women. Now the situation is much more complicated.
Right, but back in the
back in those days,
70s.
yeah.
Now, and were the people that worked with you largely women?
Largely women, and not only that, but one of the aspects of the center was that we had very good benefits, and we had very good policies on leave, maternity leave, and many of the women lawyers told me that the most important thing about working at the center to them was that it was a woman and family-friendly place to work. And I did not realize that because, of course, that's what I wanted.
Right.
And so it never occurred to me that I wouldn't set up a workplace where everybody had that. And so that was very distinctive about the center. And we funded that ourselves. We paid for health insurance. We even had a little retirement benefits. And because I was very successful in raising money, and we kept the place going. You remember, it was we started pre-legal services, then legal services came in, but we occupied some of the space. So, and there was a lot of tension with them. That was another source of tension, was with legal services.
Because?
They had a much more traditional model than we did, and they also didn't have the law students, and so and they also were a little more traditional. We did policy work, they didn't. So all in all, there was some tension with them, and there was a little battle over some funding as well.
Right, right.
But then I think it was in the 80s, I realized that we could not continue with paying for my salary and the lawyer's salary. We had to begin to move people onto the university, and that became then an issue of the university at that point, and that's why June Weisberger came in, because June Weisberger was a professor at the law school, and she was very active in women's issues on the campus. And at that point, I was only a recipient of it. I didn't really understand what was going on. The university decided the way to get more women faculty, in part, was to move people who were clinical or specialists or in these sort of subcategories, move them up into some form of more academic position so that there would be more women teaching, and the inequality between the men and the women was decreased. And so they began to set up these categories, and one of them was what they call they set up a clinical professor category, which
Right.
came out of of course, the medical school model, and so they set that up, and then we were able to get status that way, and we were able to get our salaries paid, and of course our salaries increased, and then also the fringe benefits, plus the fundraising then was reduced.
Right, right. But those kind of positions were not protected like tenure positions.
You
right?
bet.
Right.
You bet. And Wisconsin was very slow, and to this day has not accomplished merge status.
Okay.
And is right now, this very moment, that issue is going on.
Yes, yes. As it is in other schools and other places as well. So what was your favorite part about the clinic?
Well, I love working with the students. I love doing the work. I love being, it was, now I was not I was active as an advocate in policy work. I did a lot of work in administrative agencies. I did a lot of work in providing policy papers, but I never did really any individual advocacy. Mm-hmm. Those programs were run by the other lawyers in the
right.
firm. And I developed them and dreamed them up, and we had a lot of interesting styles of advocacy. But I myself did not sit down next to a person and do the Social Security.
Right, right.
I never did that.
Yeah.
So, but I loved organizing, and I loved, I didn't mind fundraising, and I had a good time, and I loved the students, and was not a great teacher, formal teacher. Then what happened is eventually I began to teach regular courses in the law school. The law school began to see that it made sense to to do more, and in the early 90s, well, I taught poverty. I began to teach poverty law, which was a natural outgrowth of
right.
A lot of the work we did at the center, and there was nobody teaching poverty law, and I was involved in something called the Inter-University Consortium on Poverty Law, which I helped develop. And I began to teach poverty law, and then I wrote a casebook, shared it with a colleague. Mm-hmm. And we published a casebook on poverty law. So that was a regular law school course. And then in the early 90s, one of the professors asked me to start teaching health law because they didn't have a health law teacher. And a lot of my advocacy, my own personal advocacy at that point, was in health.
Ah, okay.
And I began to teach the basic health law course.
Still as in this sort of separate status.
You bet.
Okay. And what was the most frustrating thing? Was there a frustrating thing about the clinic?
The most frustrating thing to me was the status issue. And particularly after I began to teach courses and I began to write and publish. I didn't do any writing. I really accepted the fact that I was a practitioner and that was my place. Mm-hmm. And I taught students how to practice. And then I said, no, people began to write up what work I did. And I said, no, I'm going to write my own story. And I started to write in the 90s. So there I was writing and I was teaching. And I thought, why do I have this separate status and why am I paid so much less?
Right.
And I asked people for advice about what to do. And they said the only way is for you to go on the job market and get an offer. Mm. And the only way to do that would have had my husband also go on the job market. Well, we were a idiosyncratic couple, not easily hired by a law school that we would want to go to.
Right.
And I just felt to put ourselves going through that process
right.
would have been very difficult for the family.
Right.
So I decided against it, and that was it. So to me, that was the main problem. But I wanted to continue to do. When I started doing the regular courses, I did them with a problem method. I never was very good or very interested in teaching the standard way in which you teach. I always wanted the kind of
like a problem-based
method.
Right. Okay. Did you have any mentors, and were they women mentors or male mentors as you were going through your career, both with the law firm before the clinic and then with the clinic?
Not really. As far as women, none that stand out to me. My friend Jane was a big help to me because she had set up a public interest law firm like mine, but that was peer-to-peer. I can't say that there were older women. No, I mean, they really did fall. There was not really that category. There were some men that were very helpful to me, but I can't say that any particular women stood out. I tried myself to do what I could, as I say, but it was more peer-to-peer.
Okay. And did you have a support group of women, if you will, or even of men, I guess, a group that, as you were going through these difficult times with the clinic and frustrations with all the things that were happening, did you have people you could lean on?
No, one of my frustrations was that the other clinicians were not interested in the issue of the status, and I had no support there.
And
that was in the early. The men were much more concerned, and there was an effort in the late '80s from some of the clinicians to try to speak out, and it was rejected.
Right. So the male clinicians were interested,
yes.
And the female ones weren't.
Well, I don't want to put it that clear. In recent time, my group, which were men and women, when they went on into the law school, they all sort of figured out their own thing. It was more in the Remington Center is where you've had more developments, and I can't really speak to that very well, but that's where more of the agitation. No, that's not fair. One of the lawyers, one of the people from my law, from the center who became a clinician, tried to get move into the tenure track line in Wisconsin and was rejected, and he moved to Minnesota. Okay. So he did that. He and his wife moved with him. She had a tenured position here.
Oh my!
And so they did what my husband and I did not do, and they both went to Minnesota. No, he went to Minnesota and she went to Oxford. They didn't stay. They didn't both get. They had a commuting situation.
Oh my! That's a long.
But their children were older by that point.
Right. So in your children, then you've obviously been staying in Wisconsin. Although it looks like you in 2002. What happened?
2002. I visited Harvard.
Okay.
Harvard Law School, yeah.
Okay, and what did you do there?
Well, I taught. They were interested in having somebody. They were having difficulties with their clinical program, and they wanted me to be there for the year and sort of consult with them about what to do.
Okay.
And so I taught there. I taught public interest law and I taught health law.
Okay. All right, and then, but had you retired from Wisconsin, or were you just?
No, I didn't retire, but that was the end of my association with the center. That what happened is, then through the 90s, we kept it going. We always kept the separate public interest law firm, but it got smaller, and most of the lawyers became clinicians at Wisconsin, and it was a clinical program, and I maintained the public interest law firm vision of it. And then when I left in 2002, I said, okay, I'm no longer going to be the clinical director. That was my title. And they turned it over to somebody who was teaching a poverty law clinic, and she changed the name and dismantled and played down basically the separate public interest law part. Now, when Marcia Mansfield came in, maybe 10 years ago, she kept the name, but associated much more with the center tradition. Okay.
And then, so you went to Harvard for a year, and then after that?
I came back and I taught health law.
Okay.
And had externships, and I worked till, when did I retire? 2008, maybe. Okay. And then we moved to New York in 2010, but I continued to write and research.
Right, and then looks like you were an adjunct for a while at Seton Hall.
Yep. Yes, and that was interesting. They have a big health law program, and now they have a lot of women. They have a law school that has a lot of dominant women, but they've had their problems now with the problems in legal education. So they had a lot of adjuncts. And because New Jersey and in Trenton, and they have a lot of people who are happy to adjunct there.
Right.
And they let most of them go because they were having so many financial problems.
And so so the adjuncts were they primarily female then, or women, or just?
I really don't know.
Okay.
I really don't know.
Okay. So then you were mentioning the New Yorker article I read was interesting, sort of bringing your lawsuit around. It was based on privacy, or at least that's the direction they were going. Griswold was based on privacy, and then, as we know, that privacy notion was used in a variety of cases thereafter until we got to this summer. We got to Obergefell, and you mentioned your daughter,
Yes,
who was in the article. So can you tell us about that?
well, as I said, I had, when I went into when we got involved in the lawsuit in 1960, I was interested in women's career, and I was very interested in what some people call companionate marriage. That is, marriage where the men and women both support each other in their work and in their careers and in the household. And that was my image. That's what I was hoping for, and that was important to me. And then, of course, it became now called the balance between work and family. You know?
Right.
Because when you had changed the model, and it wasn't the women I was fighting, just to being able to not stay at home with the children but work, and that considered to be okay. So once that happened, then they realized, oh, well, you got all these other problems. So then all of a sudden it became work problems of balancing work and family.
Right.
So I was very interested in that, and I'd been always interested in that. And by the way, all my children work, and all of them would never, and they always say that compared to their friends, and this has been shown statistically, many of them don't last and begin to stay home. After they all well educated, but then they stay home because they can't balance it. They can't balance it, or they can't imagine it. It's really what on my mind is.
Right.
They just can't imagine it, and they say that it's clearly those people whose mothers worked, and in their case, mothers work, are able to do it, and those that mothers don't work have much more difficulty with it. So it is and I've seen it's been, there's statistic research to support that. But I remember my daughter in the 90s, I guess, and this was before she came out as being gay. She was with a friend who was a very well-known law professor now. She was a law professor at Wisconsin, and they were friends, and I was talking to them, and I said, well, I hope that you're going to continue to think about and write about equal marriage and how men and women could work together in marriage and they looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, what kind of problem is that to worry about? So I was just totally shocked.
Yeah. Totally
shocked. And so what it demonstrated was the complexity of what we have now, because, of course, when you have same-sex marriage, it's not the same issue. It's not. It's similar, but quite a bit different than when you have a man and a woman. So it seems to me issues haven't even begun to be thought about in same-sex marriage. And then the women have so many different options now. They can not marry at all. They can have children. Somebody was telling me she was in a big law firm and litigation partner. She's a litigation partner. She says there's like 5 or 6 women litigation partners. She's the only one who's married with children. Some of them have children and they're not married.
Or married with no children, or not married at all, right?
Or not married at all.
Right. So and I think, there's a lot of options, and
there's a lot of options, and so it's much more difficult to figure out what the policy position is, or what the individual position, or where the empathy should be, or where you should put your attention. So it's taken me a long time, and of course I was very shocked when my daughter came out. I was not one of those people who found it easy. So when I did the 2012 piece that I wrote myself, I didn't even think about tackling the question of the gay. I just said it's ended up with gay marriage, with same-sex, but I didn't tackle it at all. And partly because of the sensitivity with my daughter. But when Jill Lepore did the story, she went right to it. And it was great for my daughter and myself, because it was really kind of cathartic for us to say, okay, look, look at the story. The story is so moving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Though it was hard and a struggle for us to see the way people see it from the outside, for us it was a struggle.
Within, right.
Within.
Right. So your daughter then, and this is the one you were pregnant with,
yes.
when you went to listen to the arguments at the Supreme Court, ending up using that privacy argument gets us to marriage equality and gets her
to be married. And
married
she has
legally.
adopted a daughter, so she has a daughter.
Right.
She has a child now.
Right.
But so the whole question of balancing, of course, is now forever. And I saw Anne Marie Slaughter has written the new book and all that. What's new about it? What's new to me is the complexity of it.
Right.
Someone like Anne Marie Slaughter I understand completely, because she's just, got married and then she has the children and she thought she could do everything, and look, she can't. And
right.
So how you feel about that, I don't know. But the stories of the single mothers who want to have the children by themselves, story. I mean, this is all. What do you need a man for? I watch Girls, and I think, it's just such a different world.
Right.
And yet, to some extent, that whole question of what is it we want, if we do want to have the husband and the children and the career, the balancing of it. I mean, I've got plenty of empirical things to say. I think that I was extremely lucky in what I did. I feel, in retrospect, what I would change, one thing is I would not change my name. That was that, and of course, in those days, everybody changed their name.
Everybody
in fact,
did.
The Lucy Stonewall people, it was illegal to not change your name, and in fact,
Right.
I had that problem with my husband's residency, and that was then, a little illegal to some extent. You had to take your husband's credit, so it was a battle to keep your own name.
Right.
It wasn't like it was easy choice.
Right.
But I think it was particularly since we were in the same field, and we even wrote together. So I really think that was that I would certainly do that over. Whether I should have fought more for equality in the job, in the workplace, in the legal education.
Right.
It was a personal thing. And I think that if my husband hadn't had the difficulties that he had, and he became, famous for that, not because he wanted to be famous, it was just too emotionally difficult. And I think it would have been it was the right decision at the time. But I would have been, it would have been a risk that we didn't want to take.
Right. And sometimes you just have to make that decision
Exactly.
based on those kinds of things.
Exactly.
So that was one of the things I was going to ask you, is if you had to, in looking back on your career, on your whole path, if you had to change something, would you? And what would you change?
Well, those are the two. The first thing is the name, and the second is I might have, it was a close call, that
Right. period,
because I was unhappy in that period until I came around to grips with it. And then I went and started writing myself, and I was able, in the place I was, to change my status. That's what I did. I worked around it.
Right.
I worked around it. I didn't accept that I was going to be a clinician just like all the other clinicians.
Right.
And I worked to write. I worked to be involved with groups that include a lot of people who weren't, who were regular law professors and so forth.
Right.
I was active in Law and Society. I worked globally, and when you work outside the United States, those distinctions are not so obvious.
Right. And I was looking at your resume, and when you said you were writing, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot here. So you did a lot with that. And what would you? Your oldest daughter. Are your children lawyers? Any of your children lawyers?
No, none of them are lawyers. They all have PhDs, and
Okay.
one is a professor.
Okay. And if for the women lawyers coming in now, what would you tell them any advice that you'd give them about being a woman in the legal field, and maybe if they expressed an interest in being a woman in legal academia?
Well, I think that one thing I've seen in women who go to law school now, not talking about the public interest, or the people interested in social justice, is that many of them have no idea, and this is true of men too, but I think particularly of women, about what opportunities there are in the practice of law. Mm-hmm. They just think it's a general degree, or they think that you could do anything or whatever. You know, there's 6 or 7 or 8 things you can do. Mm-hmm. And you have to realize that and decide, I really want to do one. And you have to have some sort of passion for it. Mm-hmm. You just can't just think it's just a job.
Right.
And so once you do that, then that helps you figure out how to go from there. But I'm so surprised, because it was extremely important to me to work, but it was extremely important to me to have a career and to be a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't going to give that up. And if you don't have that, then it seems to me that it's harder to figure out how you're going to do it. The second is this idea of, which is a different way of doing the idea that you don't go in laterally. I think people have to have much more of an entrepreneurial idea, that law is not now, it's not just a technical thing that somebody will pay you for. Mm-hmm. And there are not enough jobs for all the people who want to be lawyers. So you have to be able to be entrepreneurial. And that, to me, is one of the shocking things about people now, to me, about people who want to do public interest law or social justice lawyering, is they think it's a career. That's the negative of it. When I started, there was no such career.
Right.
And we created it. And now they think it's like getting a government job.
And it's not. You don't. It's you. What would you say? You say it like it sounds like a bad thing.
Well, because I think there are not some people can have that, but the number of people, because I think it's a very fulfilling kind of work, and study after study has shown that the most satisfied, I'm sure you've seen these studies, mm-hmm. most satisfied women lawyers in particular are those who do public interest or socially kind of work. There are not enough of those jobs for the people who should want that work. Then they're going to have to figure out how they're going to be able to do that, and right. they're going to have to show some imagination.
Should there be more public interest lawyers around?
Well, I think there should be more people who do legal jobs where there's a public interest dimension. Okay. I am not a fan of the bright line between public interest and big law, or public interest and small practice. Right. I think that we have to think of more ways in which they actually come together. Come together, right? And that's part of the imagination.
So have you personally experienced, or have you seen this in legal education, where students come in and there are studies that say women, it's usually women more than men, who come into law school with this idea of doing public interest work or social justice work, but institutionally by their 3rd year, that's sort of driven out of them. Have you personally experienced, well, you've stayed with public interest work, but have you seen that, and do you think that it's changing, or has it changed, or?
Well, I think that yes, it's an issue. The socialization of law school towards conventional lawyering, towards big law, towards law that is more traditionally representing business, or is been proved over and over and over again. And how we change legal education is a good question. And some people think clinics are doing it. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Okay.
I think it's a separate issue from the clinics. I think the clinics can be helpful. The clinics do very little in career development. Mm-hmm. You see? Yeah. So we may encourage it, but then we don't help the students. You know, they're out there trying to get a job.
Right.
Now, I will say that there's one thing that I have realized in the last year, because I had conversations with students both at Harvard and at Texas. Mm-hmm. That those schools, say top 15 ranked schools, have really beefed up their support financially, emotionally, counseling for the students interested in public interest law work, which is a small percentage.
Right.
And those students feel that they can do it.
Mm-hmm.
They have resources, they have options, they have interviews. I was shocked.
Yeah.
Wisconsin, the schools below that have nothing like that.
Right.
Marquette, Wisconsin, there's nothing like that.
Right. Right.
So it's seeming what's happened is it's been a sorting among the law school. And you say legal education, you have to be more specific.
Right, right. And with the McCrate report and the Carnegie Foundation report, emphasizing that apprenticeship part of
Right.
law, and usually that comes through in legal education, that comes through the clinic. Should we be doing more of that, do you think? If nothing else, to give the students that apprenticeship opportunity, or should we incorporate it more like the schools you were talking about, where there's more of that resources, financial and otherwise?
No, but they do they give them internships. They get them summer internships that are equivalent to apprenticeship. And then they give them that's what they do. They don't fund a whole career. Mm-hmm. They fund 1, 2, 3 years out in these postgraduate programs. So
Okay.
they do, it's a kind of apprenticeship thing. And
Right.
I think that it has to be studied more carefully what these schools are doing.
Right.
Because I had no idea. And I got this information from the students.
Right.
From
right.
the students, so I believe them.
Right.
They feel supported. They feel, now they may be 2 or 3 or 4 years out,
Right.
then struggling. But I was just really, really surprised. And so I think that whole question, and I think this is a contemporary question.
Right.
I mean, I think that this is a contemporary question, and I think that I'm very interested in that. It's not a good, it's not an area that I myself have yet figured out where I can be helpful in that. I'm doing some writing on the history of the center now, and one of the things I'm interested in is what we did then, which I think is innovative and being emulated now, which was not respected or realized how important it was in the days that we were doing it then.
Doing it, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so some of that may lead to this kind of apprenticeship. But I also am a big believer in theoretical work. I don't believe in the separation between theory and practice. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that you have to know this passion. You have to understand why is it you're doing it and who you want to do it and how you're going to help do it. It can't just be it's not just a technical thing.
Right.
It's not only learning how to do Social Security applications.
Right, right. Let's see. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you would like to talk about?
Well, some people think that legal education is going to be a feminized profession. That in fact what's happening is that women are going to dominate in law teaching. And that's fine with me, I don't
Why
think
would
there's
that be a bad
anything-
thing, right?
Why would that be a bad thing? Except the argument that any time a profession becomes feminized, then it becomes loses status and income.
Actually, I'm doing research on this right now.
Uh-huh.
So, yep. And yeah, there's that like teaching in nursing suddenly, or teaching in the lower grades suddenly,
Yeah.
then that's not a valued profession. That's not paid very well, generally speaking,
Yeah.
which is a shame.
Well, the whole question is what's the future of law?
Right.
Also may be and so this relates to something else. That is the link between, when the advisor said, well, you could be a lawyer or a social worker. Public interest law, to the extent to which it deals with social and political, can be viewed as not being a lawyer, right? So we want to get away from that. We want to be able to, and I think we want law to be broadly understood.
Right.
And we want to have legal education be more interdisciplinary and more relate for people from other professions. Mm-hmm. And I think that will help create more jobs and create more meaningful work. So I think that that's one approach, and we don't want to we want to work with people in the business school. We don't want it to be only the social work school. So we want to be careful of the gender dimension in all of these kinds of moves.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, or?
I think that the linking of the networks that you asked me about, the mentorship, that if there had been more gender networks, I think would have been very helpful to my career. And my efforts to create it at Wisconsin were not successful. Partly, I'm sure, my fault, I'm sure, as well as others, but I do think that the mentoring is fine too, but I think the networking is very important. I'm a big believer of networking.
Networking, how so?
Within the women, for instance, in law school. June Weisberger, I will say, and Karen Klaus were very good networkers. I think that they tried to be helpful to me, but again, it was complex because my husband taught in the law school too, and so there were divided loyalties and not on gender issues, but on the other issues. So I think that's difficult. I think networks, within a school are harder than networks across the campus or nationally, or internationally.
Right.
But I think that it is helpful, and maybe particularly for women. So I am a believer in that.
Right, and over time that you've been here, there's obviously been more women have come onto the faculty over time, and has that changed anything, do you think, and in what way?
Well, there are some women who I'm very sympathetic and helpful, and some women who I'm, not, who have trouble working with. So just being a woman is not sufficient, particularly when there's so many more women in the field. So this is not a time, particularly when I feel I do know that that in certain periods it's very important and crucial in a person's life, and certainly when you're home with children and you're trying to figure out how you could do the balance in the career, women who have good practical advice and can give you encouragement is really important.
Right.
I think within the institution it's a little harder, because there's cross-cutting issues that play. One thing that has helped me, though, I think, at my age now, is people who say to me, "You are an influence on me, and you helped me," and they see what I did in my work in a positive light when I didn't think I was very successful or very important. That's very meaningful to me.
Yes.
So that's the reverse of mentorship. That's the mentee, or the person who's out there coming and saying, this really helped me, has been very meaningful to me. So to me now, that is more important than any mentorship I got earlier has been now, because it's given me, and therefore allows me, when I talk with other younger women or younger people, to say, okay, don't give up, don't worry, because it may turn out to
make a difference.
Make a difference.
Right.
Exactly.
So how heartening to know that you made a difference, even at the moment you were thinking, I'm not doing anything that's useful, but to somebody it was useful.
Yes.
And it did make a difference.
Yes.
So I guess I don't have anything else that I want to ask, unless there's anything else that you.
No, that's fine.
Say.
Appreciate it very much.
Sure, thank you.